Good afternoon. I'm Chloe Schwabe with the National Council of Churches Eco Justice Program, and I'm really glad you all could join us today. I particularly want to thank Ted Schettler and Maria Valenti from the Collaborative on Health and Environment for taking the time to share with us this really important emerging field of research on healthy aging, and hope that you all will also find this information particularly helpful in your own lives and in your own faith communities. So before we start with this webinar on healthy aging for an abundant life, I just want to take a moment to put us into a place of prayer. God of the air, sky, and heavens above, thank you for your beautiful creation. May we learn to be good stewards of our bodies and all of creation and protect it from toxic chemicals that contaminate food, air, and water. O Creator, as we come together as a community of elders and those concerned with the health of older adults, we recognize that some members of our community are suffering from illnesses such as heart disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes. Help us to find ways to support each other and strengthen bonds as a community of Christ followers. Spirit of life, may we learn the knowledge today that can build on the wisdom we have gained throughout our lifetime. May these new lessons be helpful to us and serve to improve the health of today's children and our own bodies so that we may all live and have good health in our old age. Thank you, and amen. So health, wholeness, holiness, it's all connected. As we age, we gain wisdom about how interdependent we are as a community. The health of one impacts an entire family and community. God calls us to live as one body of Christ, to live in shalom. Chronic diseases in our families and communities can challenge this calling, for fighting illness can test our strength. The hope is that we can find comfort and grow stronger as a community through this process. As many aging adults start to develop chronic diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, cancer, heart disease, or asthma, it is important to take time to examine why these health conditions are increasing and how we can best address the sufferings of each other and those in our community. And just as Jesus healed the sick, and we can also follow his example by taking steps to improve our own health as we age and the health of our aging neighbors. It is important to address and find the root causes of chronic disease so that we can all age as healthily as possible in mind, body, and spirit. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the work of the National Council of Churches Environmental Health Initiative, we have been working in many states over the course of the last 5 years to educate people of faith about toxic chemical exposures in our everyday lives. And those include everything from baby bottles and sippy cups to toxic solvents that we use in our cleaning products and also even in our cookware. And we also then try to educate people about sustainable alternatives and healthy alternatives that they can use and implement in their individual lives, and then also find actions that they can take as congregations, and also to change policy. So together we try to educate and promote worship materials and witness and respond to the cry of creation. We're also called to, we also set up a number of faith principles that we use to guide our work. And the first principle that we are concerned about is protecting creation. And according to our faith tradition, we were put in the garden to serve and protect creation, to be stewards of creation. And we know that God made the earth and called it good. And so our job is to make sure that we do protect the gifts that God has given us, and also the entire creation. And we also know that Christ's salvation encompasses not only humankind, but the entire world. And so that is also why we are called to recognize the importance of creation in our lives and our move to do what we can to protect it. We're also called to care for our bodies. And Paul teaches us in 1 Corinthians that our bodies are temples to the Holy Spirit. And so we should be making sure that what we put in our bodies, what we expose our bodies to over the course of our day doesn't harm our body. And additionally, we also can see protecting and caring for the body as the larger piece, that we're all part of one body of Christ. And that means that creation, all of creation, and including humankind, is all part of the same body. And so we're called to care for and protect the whole body of Christ. We also want to see justice for vulnerable populations. And we know from Matthew that we are called to protect the least of these. And certainly when thinking about healthy aging and some of the threats to healthy aging, we're particularly concerned about pregnant women and the fetus that she's carrying, as well as the health of children and other vulnerable communities, such as people living with developmental and learning disabilities and physical disabilities. And we're also concerned about older adults and people with compromised immune systems. So for all these reasons, we're concerned about justice for vulnerable populations. And lastly, we hold up this principle of sustainability and wanting to make sure that we protect creation for the generations that come, not just today, but for the generations to come. Let they be 2 generations from now or 7 generations from now. But we want to make sure that the products that we use in our daily lives don't contribute harm to the future generations that come. And unfortunately, there is science showing that some exposures to toxic chemicals, even starting in the womb, can carry for many generations to come and have very harmful health effects for those generations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted Schettler, Dr. Ted Schettler, to talk to us a little bit more about the environmental threats to healthy aging. Thank you.
And the systems for moving around in them, which influence our exercise and activity levels. And then I want to talk about the psychological and socioeconomic stressors that are sometimes associated with these environments, and then we'll talk about some of the cross-cutting opportunities for policy solutions. On this slide, on the left, I have simply shown the various environments that I just described to you, and then over on the far right are a number of the chronic diseases and disorders which really do sort of are featured in our communities and families these days. Diabetes, obesity, abnormal cholesterol and other blood lipids, metabolic syndrome, which is really a collection of the early manifestations of diabetes, heart disease, and overweight, Cardiovascular disease, which Chloe has mentioned, still the leading cause of death in the United States. And the reason we call this the Western disease cluster is because they actually tend to co-occur both in individuals and also in societies as they adopt certain Western habits of agriculture, diet, nutrition, exercise levels, and so on. So they both occur in individuals together as well as in societies. And what we want to point out here is that these are not only problematic in themselves, but they are also risk factors for further problems later in life, including neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So these really are all linked through some common biologic pathways, which I will briefly describe. Okay, so what you see here is sort of a description of how things have changed in recent years with overweight and obesity, for example, doubling over the last 25 years in the United States. It's become an enormous public health concern. Diabetes or pre-diabetes has also doubled over the past 20 years, and now 40% of U.S. adults either have diabetes or pre-diabetes. Cardiovascular disease, still the leading cause of death. Metabolic syndrome, I've mentioned, and Alzheimer's disease, of course, is increasing. And as people get older, we can expect to see Alzheimer's disease increase even more markedly. Next slide, please. So this slide shows that the over 65 population will nearly double by 2030 to over 71 million, which of course is going to sharply increase the number of people who are at risk for chronic neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, among others. And it's not only the diseases that I've mentioned, but you can see that, for example, here in this graph that as in people who are 65 and over, cancer really becomes a major issue for about 25% of the population. High blood pressure still increasing and a major problem, leading to increased risk of heart disease and stroke. Arthritis, a very common disabling disorder in the older population. Just to check now, does this show the ecological system slide to you?
Yes, I passed on the presenter privileges to you, Ted.
Okay. So I want to make certain to remind us that individuals do not live in isolation, but actually live in relationships with other family members, with the larger community, with ecological systems in those communities, and then society at large. And there's a lot of interaction and crosstalk across these various levels, and so they each interact with each other, and therefore we really need to consider these multiple levels of influence when we're considering what health risks are for our individuals. The other point I want to make is that we need to consider this in a life course. Even though we are talking about diseases that often appear later in life, midlife or beyond, we really need to go back to the beginning, because science is telling us in recent years that the foundation for many of these diseases and disorders that show up later in life are actually laid at the time of fetal development, infancy, and childhood. In fact, in many ways, this era really goes back to before conception, because the health of mother and father, as they're beginning their families, can have a profound influence on the health of the developing child. I just use as an example on this slide to show you how, for example, the exposures during pregnancy, for example, to air pollution or inadequate nutrition, can influence the birth weight of a baby. And a child who is born at low birth weight, who then experiences rapid catch-up growth after birth, is at risk for developing diabetes and obesity in early adulthood and certainly into midlife. And then diabetes and obesity, it midlife are themselves risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia later in life. So we really do need to use a life course perspective here. Another example that I'll mention later on is the way in which early life exposures to pesticides, which are part of our food production system, can increase the risk of Parkinson's disease decades later. So let me just talk briefly about a few of the mechanisms of action that link these various environments to the health outcomes that I've described. The first one I want to briefly mention is inflammation. This is a normal phenomenon. It's part of our immune system. It helps us to fight off infections and so on. When we injure ourselves or we get a skin infection, we're accustomed to seeing redness and swelling at the site of the injury or infection. That's a normal part of the healing process. But we now know that inflammation actually can be internal and can be chronic and be pathological, as well as being part of the healing immune system. So that if inflammation gets turned on and remains chronically elevated at excessive levels, it is actually an underlying dimension of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, most cases of obesity, cardiovascular disease, many neurodegenerative disorders, and various kinds of cancer as well. The second biologic mechanism I want to briefly mention is excessive oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is a normal biological phenomenon. We live in an oxygen-rich environment. We use oxygen to help metabolize our food and to make energy in what's called the mitochondria of our cells. In the process of using the oxygen for that purpose, we create what's called reactive oxygen species. These are molecules of oxygens linked together that can be very destructive to tissues. And over a period of evolutionary time, we have also acquired antioxidant capacity in order to quench these reactive oxidative species so that they don't do excessive damage. That antioxidant capacity is both built into our metabolism, but also comes from the various foods that we eat. And so, for example, a diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables has antioxidants in it, which help to keep this system in balance. I should point out that there are also external sources of oxidative stress, things like tobacco smoke and air pollutants that come from industrial processes also elevate reactive oxygen species levels, and various pesticides and other industrial chemicals do the same thing. So that if this gets out of balance and we have excessive amounts of reactive oxygen species without adequate amounts of antioxidants, we get tissue injury as a result. And what I want to point out is that both oxidative stress and inflammation actually reinforce each other, so that they interact and cause a buildup of both. And then the third biologic mechanism that I'll briefly mention is insulin signaling. We're accustomed to thinking of insulin as a hormone that comes from the pancreas that keeps our blood sugar under control, and people who have type 1 diabetes do not have adequate amounts of insulin, and people who have type 2 diabetes either have inadequate amounts of insulin or are insulin resistant. But in either case, what happens is that the blood sugar goes up if insulin levels are not adequate. But there's another couple of functions of insulin that we don't typically think about. It also helps to keep our blood vessels, our arteries, compliant and flexible and healthy. It helps to keep our triglycerides, some of the blood lipids, in their normal range. And when insulin signaling gets disrupted, we actually see an increase in blood sugars, but also stiffening of the arteries with increased risks of arterial disease, as well as elevated blood triglycerides. And these are then components of underlying heart disease. And here we see that all these biologic pathways are actually interrelated. As I've mentioned, inflammation and oxidative stress both tend to reinforce each other, and the two of them together help to disrupt insulin signaling. So we really get into a positive feedback loop here where these three biologic pathways are interrelated and reinforcing. So now, with that as background, let me just quickly talk about these various environments and how they're playing against those biologic pathways. And the first one I'll mention is the food system and our diet and nutrition. As you can see here on this slide, we see some familiar sights. We see a child getting candy out of a candy machine. This is a source of refined carbohydrates, which are an increasing percentage of the total calories that are consumed by most children, actually, in our communities today. We see more refined carbohydrates in the hamburger bun, shown here. In the hamburger itself are saturated fats from the beef, as well as in the cheese. We see French fries that have been fried in some kind of oil, and depending on what kind of oil it is, these French fries will have different kinds of biologic effects. For example, if there are trans fats in the oil, that promotes trans fats in the diets really promote inflammation quite strongly. But you'll also notice what's missing in this slide, and that is there's very little here in the way of fruits and vegetables. And this has become a real public health problem in our communities now because very few people in our families and communities are actually eating the recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables on a daily basis. The high glycemic carbohydrates, which I mentioned from refined sugars like in the candy or the white hamburger bun, are a problem because they cause a rapid spike in the blood sugar followed by a rapid spike in insulin in order to get the blood sugar under control. And so you see here how plasma insulin rapidly goes up after a diet that's rich in refined high glycemic carbohydrates, only to be followed by a sharp decline, which then is followed by another a jolt of high glycemic carbohydrates and insulin, and you get this kind of yo-yoing effect with high glycemic carbohydrates that actually then begins over time to promote insulin resistance, which underlies diabetes ultimately, as well as promoting various forms of inflammation. The fats are also an important consideration. I mentioned saturated fats in the hamburger. I also want to point out that there's a whole family of fats called unsaturated fats, and they can be broken down into various kinds. Here are the polyunsaturated fatty acids and then monounsaturated fatty acid. Here, this monounsaturated fatty acid in olive oil is the prominent one is called oleic acid, which is really a very health-promoting fatty acid. Among the polyunsaturated fatty acids, there are two kinds, omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6s. Both of these are essential fatty acids. We really need them. We can't manufacture them internally, so we need to get them through our diet. And over the years, because of the way our food system has evolved, we're actually getting large amounts now of omega-6 fatty acids when compared to the amount of omega-3 fatty acids that we're getting in our diet. And just to give you a rough idea of how this has changed, probably 50 to 75 years ago, the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 or 3 to 1. So we're getting more 6s than 3s, but maybe twice as many. Now, because of all the processed food in our diet and the way our food system has evolved, it's very common for people to be getting maybe 15 or even 20 times as much omega-6 fatty acids as 3s. So whereas they're both essential in our diet, we've gotten a skewed ratio between them, such as that we're getting far more 6s than 3s. And the 3s, have a lot of health-promoting effects that we are missing because we've moved more to a processed diet that is filled with animal products that come from grain-fed animals, far higher in omega-6s than animals, for example, that are raised on grass, where the omega-3 fatty acid content is higher. And the reason this is important is because you'll see here on this chart that omega-3 fatty acids are actually metabolized into chemicals called eicosanoids, which basically have almost exclusively anti-inflammatory properties, whereas the omega-6 fatty acids that have increased so much in comparison to the 3s have both anti-inflammatory but also pro-inflammatory properties. And this is a particular concern because of the, as I've mentioned previously, the inflammation that underlies so many of the chronic diseases and disorders of our time. And then if we look at saturated fats, the fats that come from primarily meat and dairy products, cheese and so on, we see they also have pro-inflammatory effects. Through a slightly different mechanism, they happen to trigger the innate immune system, which we were born with. And interestingly, the fats themselves tend to trigger that and cause it to turn on, resulting in an underlying inflammatory process. So in sum, what we have done is, by the way we've modified our food production system and what we're eating, is we've created a pro-inflammatory diet, which then, of course, helps to promote those diseases and disorders that I mentioned. And so if we put this all together, we can say with a good deal of confidence that diets that are characterized by saturated and trans fats, that have high glycemic carbohydrates in them, that lack fruits and vegetables, and have a large excess of omega-6s over omega-3 fatty acids, really increase the risks of a number of diseases and disorders. Whereas diets that are characterized by large amounts of fruits and vegetables, legumes like lentils and chickpeas and so on, higher levels of omega-3s that come from a number of sources, but probably the richest source is various kinds of cold water fish. Low glycemic carbohydrates, which are primarily whole grains that are not metabolized as quickly as the refined grains that I mentioned, put together with nuts, small amounts of wine with meals, often put together in what's called a Mediterranean diet or a Mediterranean-like diet. This combination, this dietary pattern, is very beneficial and reduces the risks of these diseases and disorders. And here I've just given you a sample of some of the prospective observational studies that show that this kind of a diet strongly reduces the risk of diabetes. This is even in people who are at risk of diabetes, where you see that this kind of diet, often in combination with moderate levels of exercise, has a profound effect on reducing the onset of diabetes, even in people who are at risk. Similarly, reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular mortality, a strong effect on cancer mortality, and this is not the same for all kinds of cancer. For some, it's more prominent than from others. Some of the earliest studies are showing that this kind of diet can reduce mortality from Alzheimer's disease, as well as reducing the risk of Parkinson's disease. So that's just observational studies, and when you look at the clinical intervention studies, you see very similar numbers and same kinds of outcomes, with lower risks of heart disease and cardiac death in people who already have heart disease, decrease in the metabolic syndrome, decrease in markers of inflammation, decreased evidence of insulin resistance, and of course weight loss as well. And I want to point out that putting this together with moderate levels of exercise, and when I say that, I'm talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 150 minutes a week, which is really about 20 minutes a day of moderate-paced walking, combined with this diet, can have profound benefits in terms of reducing the onset of these diseases and disorders, which then are so disabling later in life. And if we put these dietary features on top of those biologic pathways that I showed previously, you can see how we're actually driving this whole system by having too few antioxidants in our diet, too few fruits and vegetables, by having a very skewed ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s and thereby pushing the inflammatory component here, saturated fat pushing inflammation, high glycemic carbohydrates causing disrupted insulin signaling, and so on. Let me then move on to the second environment, the physical environment, including toxic chemicals, and I will, because of the limits of time, just mention a couple to give you some idea of where the science is on this. This slide here is to simply show you that air pollution, which comes from traffic, for example, or from industrial emissions, coal-fired power plants or other sources, actually not only has adverse impacts on the cardiovascular system and the lungs, but we now know is also a cause of an inflammatory reaction in the brain through processes that are now fairly well described, where you get an up-regulation of inflammatory markers that combine with a change in enzyme levels, along with the excess of dietary omega-6 fatty acids compared to 3s, resulting in inflammatory changes in the brain, similar to those kinds of changes that are seen with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. And I should point out that whereas those initial studies were done in cities where air pollution was extraordinarily high, we have more recent data now from cities like Boston and ordinary cities in Germany, where in the general population, one can actually see increased cognitive decline and an increased risk of dementia in people, older people, as a function of the level of traffic-related air pollution that they've been exposed to in their adult life. The second chemical I want to briefly mention is lead, because it's been so instructive to us. We've known for a long time that lead exposure during development, during fetal development, during infancy and childhood, interferes with normal brain development, and we now have data from older populations based on being able to estimate lifelong lead exposures by measuring through a non-invasive technique, measuring lead levels in bone and getting an estimate of what lifelong lead exposures have been, because lead gets deposited in the bone over time, showing that people in the workplace who are exposed to higher levels of lead are at risk for more rapid cognitive decline later in life, as well as a marked increase in the risk of Parkinson's disease. Following these studies, investigators went into the general communities and found that the same thing was going on, that people who were not necessarily exposed in the workplace, but who were exposed just because of past lead use in society more generally, that people exposed to the higher levels of lead also were at higher risk for cognitive decline later in life. And it was interesting to note that these impacts are actually greater in people who are living in stressful neighborhoods. And what I mean by stressful neighborhood is a neighborhood where people don't necessarily feel safe, that they feel that they have to be hyper-vigilant when they go out. They're concerned about their safety and so on. You begin to see how these environments come together to magnify the effects of each other. So this combination of higher lead level exposures along with living in an unsafe neighborhood has an even bigger impact on cognitive decline. A large number of studies have been done showing that excessive exposure to various pesticides is associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. There are now dozens of studies in the medical literature that have looked at this, and the great majority of them find an increased risk of Parkinson's disease with higher levels of exposure to pesticides. This might be in farm workers, it might be in people in the ordinary community who have been using pesticides of various kinds in home and gardening purposes and so on. Since this observation was made, a large amount of laboratory animal studies and other kinds of laboratory work has been done to try to understand this phenomenon. And work done by this group at the University of Rochester has actually shown that combinations of exposures to various pesticides like Maneb and Paraquat, which is a fungicide and an herbicide that is still widely used in commercial agriculture in the United States, particularly in states like Florida and California, where a lot of our food supply comes from, that in laboratory studies, early life exposures to these chemicals or to one of these two chemicals actually primes the brain in such a way that it makes it much more susceptible to re-exposure during adult life, with impacts on the area of the brain associated with Parkinson's disease. And when this was described in the scientific literature, an epidemiologic study was put together that wondered whether or not they could see the same thing in human populations who were living in communities where these same pesticides were used. And indeed, they showed that the same thing was the case with in the general population in those communities, where people who live nearest the fields where these pesticides, this fungicide and this herbicide were used, were at markedly increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Let me briefly go on to the built environment, including the socioeconomic component of it. The way we build our communities has a big influence on how we move around and how much activity we get. And it's a sad truth that exercise and activity levels have declined as people assume a more sedentary kind of existence. And it's just worth pointing out that the data are very clear that regular levels of exercise, often very moderate, as I mentioned, at the level of 20 minutes a day, not particularly excessive intensity, but moderate speed walking, and then increasing as people feel more comfortable with it, has a strong influence on health. Some of the biologic mechanisms are understood whereby regular exercise actually reduces ongoing levels of oxidative stress and inflammation. It lowers the risks of Alzheimer's, dementia, and cognitive decline. And a recent meta-analysis of 9 large studies that looked at this relationship between exercise and Alzheimer's disease showed in some about a 30% decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease in people who regularly exercised in the neighborhood of 120 to 150 minutes a week. Green space and contact with the natural world has many health benefits. In the hospital, it shortens post-surgical recovery time and reduces the need for pain medications if people are able to see outside a window into some green space as opposed to looking at a brick wall or into a parking lot. If children with attention deficit disorder are taken for a walk in the park, the beneficial effects are equivalent in magnitude to some of the medications that are used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And when we start thinking about this, we begin to wonder about the importance of having parks where it's safe for children and their caretakers to walk regularly without being concerned about their safety. We also know that access to green space reduces the effect of poverty on mortality by up to 50%. This is a profound benefit of green space associated with, that reduces the effect of poverty, which itself is so strong. Lower socioeconomic status basically increases the risk of many, many diseases and disorders, including the neurodevelopmental problems that I've mentioned early in life, as well as neurodegenerative diseases later in life, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, various kinds of cancer, metabolic syndrome, and so on. Lower socioeconomic status is just an extraordinarily important variable for us to keep in mind as a risk factor. This is probably due to combinations of increased exposures to hazards in certain communities and homes where people of lower socioeconomic status live. as well as increased susceptibility and a decreased capacity for them to cope and recover. And we see elevated levels of inflammatory markers and stress hormones in people who live under lower socioeconomic circumstances. So we put all those together on this underlying core set of biologic pathways that I earlier showed you. You can begin to see how we're driving them all through these various environments that we live in and have constructed. We're driving them frequently in disease-promoting ways rather than health-promoting ways. And although this diagram now looks kind of complicated, and you begin to ask yourself, well, what are we going to do here, and where do we intervene? We begin to, as we study this complexity, we begin not only to accept the fact that it's complicated, but we can also begin to see places where we can intervene, to begin to shift the entire behavior of this system in more health-promoting ways. And with that, I want to pass this off to Maria, who will begin to talk about some of those interventions that we might consider. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ted, for that great summary of the health effects of the multiple environments. So I'm here to bring the good news. The good news is that there are multiple opportunities for positive changes that we can all participate in and contribute to. And many of them are cross-cutting, so multiple benefits do accrue. And most of the actions that foster healthy aging are the same ones that help create a healthier overall environment, so will help mitigate, and will also help mitigate climate change. But healthy communities for children are healthy communities for people in midlife and so forth and so on. So this slide just sort of summarizes what Ted just talked about, that the important environmental determinants of health include the food system, nutrition and diet, toxic chemicals, the built environment, physical activity that's integrated into everyday living, the natural environment, and the psychological and socioeconomic environments. So this goes back also to the ecological model, talking about how major illnesses are preventable and some of the initiatives that we can undertake to reduce risks. So I'd like to say a few words about policies at various levels and how interdependent they are, just like this ecological model here. So a policy at a personal level might just be considered a choice, hopefully informed by the best information possible. Policies might also be considered decisions at the community or business level, or they might take the form of regulations by government or legislation. Personal choices are influenced greatly by public decisions and policies that might prevent or encourage us to act in a certain way, and vice versa, public policies. So, for example, I might make a personal choice to eat as many organic vegetables as possible, but that might be hampered by both availability and cost. In fact, some people don't have access to healthy food at all in places that we've come to know now as food deserts. So at the same time, availability of products might be driven by consumer demand. Let me just tell you a little personal story. Many years ago, when organic fruits and vegetables meant a few misshapen and rotting apples in a dark corner of the produce section, I volunteered on an environmental shopping campaign to encourage grocery stores to broaden their investment in more organic foods. And in my local supermarket, I found the produce manager and asked if the store would consider providing more choices in this area. To my surprise, he was surprised at my request and said no one had ever asked him before. And he was actually going into a management meeting that very morning, and he was going to bring it up. So I like to think that that exchange was one small part of a consumer movement that grew and ultimately has brought organic, natural, and less processed food sections to most stores, which virtually didn't exist before. So you can see the ecological model is very dynamic, as Ted talked about. Cross-talking, in and out, feedback loops, and policies are made by interaction between and among all the groups and at all levels. And I firmly believe that what each of us chooses to do does have consequences. So developing and nurturing livable communities is one of the most direct ways we can enhance healthy living for all ages. Landscapes that are walkable, accessible to everyone, including those with disabilities, safe from crime, and also from environmental pollution, are health promoting and can help combat the obesity epidemic that Ted Schettler spoke about. Access and safety are important factors in community planning. There's a program called Complete Streets developed by AARP and others, which is an example of a program that addresses this, with the idea that streets ought to be for everyone, young, old, motorist, bicyclist, walker, wheelchair user, bus rider, or shopkeeper. But too many are designed only for cars. So this program is asking city and town planners and engineers to design and build road networks that are safer, more livable, and welcoming to everyone. When they did an analysis, the Public Policy Institute found that a majority of the planners and engineers hadn't even begun to prepare for the coming increase in older Americans. And they also found that nearly 50% of older Americans say they can't safely cross a main street near their home. So clearly we need to make some policy changes. And I would encourage you to go out and do a little street audit in your own neighborhood to see whether or not you can actually get across town using sidewalks. Fear of crime is also an important factor. A report by the Prevention Institute in California details how violence and fear of violence causes people to be less physically active. So we need to improve safety for everyone in the community. And then finally, environmental hazards can also impede healthy activity. You know, when you see on TV the air quality index is not good, you probably don't want to be exercising outside, especially if you have any respiratory problems. And although outdoor air quality has been generally improving over the past few decades, emission of air pollutants continues to play an important role in the number of air quality issues. So there are some positive movements across the country to create healthier communities, such as this slide just points out two of them. The Transition Towns, Transition Network, supporting community-led responses to climate change and addressing energy issues, and Smart Growth America, which is a national organization dedicated to bringing smart growth policies to communities nationwide. So there are a lot of choices we can make at a personal level on a daily basis that can begin to make a difference in our health. And the four pillars that we talked about and that Ted just outlined in quite a bit of detail in terms of the scientific underpinnings of this include eating healthy food, whole, fresh, unprocessed food as much as possible, not too much. As Michael Pollan says, nothing your grandmother wouldn't recognize. Avoiding toxicants whenever possible. Incorporating activity, not exercise, but activity into daily life. Being socially engaged in your community, with your family and friends. And also having a purpose in life, which is one of the hallmarks of healthy, long-lived people. So this goes back to what Ted was talking about how important exercise is. Sitting is the new smoking is a term that's come up now. Typical average American adults average only maybe 3,000 steps a day, and even that is tough if you have a desk job. And now the goal is to get to 10,000 steps a day. Which is roughly equivalent to what Ted was talking about, 20 to 30 minutes of moderate exercise a day, which is the recommended health benefit. This woman may be taking it a little too far, trying to multitask in a lot of different ways, but this is a little bit more of the way of the future. And a lot of people are beginning to stand up at their desks or really focus on taking more frequent breaks. There's some movements afoot to address people that have to sit, people's worker rights that have to sit and type or do things behind a computer all day long. This is another sort of creative effort to increase people's exercise, and it just points out that oftentimes, all the time, almost all the time, there's an escalator and stairs next to each other, and frequently you'll see a good portion of the people taking the escalator up the stairs. Well, Volkswagen in Sweden installed musical pads into a staircase in Stockholm, and found that 66% of the people who would have taken the escalator chose the stairs instead, at least for the first few times. I don't know if they followed people after that, but I think we need to create our own enjoyable ways of exercising and little techniques to get more steps into the day. A pedometer is a good way to do that. If you wear one, you'd be amazed at how many steps you're not taking. So major illnesses are preventable. This is just another slide showing, really focusing on policy initiatives and not personal initiatives, moving into the community, business, and government policy arena that really does affect personal choices. So when people say you have to make lifestyle changes, that's often really dominated and organized in your community by the policies and the neighborhoods that you live in, and the policies of all the different levels of government and businesses. So many policies, such as supporting local and sustainable food production, clean renewable energy, or investing in green product design, have cross-cutting benefits, and that's what we need to be looking at. What can we do that can have benefits in many different areas? So, for example, reducing the use of toxic chemicals can improve worker health, can also reduce costs for businesses, including liability and cleanup costs, can improve the ecosystem, create new jobs. If you look at changing mass transit or investing in mass transit that connects bike paths and sidewalks, so not only are you reducing air pollution, but you're also tackling the obesity problem by encouraging people to walk more. So these are not just dreams; they're visions of people around the country. I'm going to shorten things up just a little bit because of the time right now. But let me just say there's probably a group in your community or workplace focused on greening the environment or developing smart growth planning. Why not look them up and get involved and lend your expertise? As Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does. So you can be a part of that change. Going back to Chloe's introduction, Healthy Aging for an Abundant Life, this relatively new guide was described at the beginning of this presentation, and we urge you to take a look at it. Use it in your homes, in your congregations, in your communities, and also check out the website, the NCC website, for a host of other resources you can use in your activism. This is just an example of ways to get involved. Nearly 3,000, maybe it's more than that, by now, 3,000 people of faith and 34 organizations endorsed the Interfaith Statement for Chemical Policy Reform. There's a movement afoot right now to reform chemical regulation, to reduce exposures, and that's part of what NCC has been involved in. There are other national or local policies, such as the Farm Bill, that can have an enormous impact on such issues as climate change as well as nutrition. The industrial food and meat production system contributes nearly a fifth of the greenhouse gases, for example. And as I already mentioned, there are also many smart growth initiatives across the country, communities introducing innovative programs for health promotion. A lot of those are profiled. EPA has an aging initiative, has a Building Healthy Communities for Active Aging report and award showcasing some of those communities from coast to coast. This slide shows a few more examples, ranging from government policies to personal business and community choices. I was happy to see when I was looking into this that many states, through the government-subsidized Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which used to be called food stamps, is now helping to bring food to many, more healthier food to low-income Americans and also to seniors by offering coupons to use at farmers markets, roadside stands, and community-supported agriculture programs. And the Women's Infants and Children Program, which people may be familiar with, also has a similar coupon initiative. So this is good news. And they're field testing some of these programs to determine if these incentives work. And to me, that's good government, and we need to press for more of those types of programs and investments. So just to sum it up, working together to address common challenges has always been a central tenet of all religions and spiritual practices. I hope that our healthy aging work can intersect in this important arena. And I'd just like to close with some thoughts about the commonalities that have been found among those communities with the longest lived populations, such as the Okinawans, who are among the healthiest elders in the world. You've heard this before, but it bears repeating one more time. Regular physical movement incorporated into daily living, good community and family relationships, eating well, having a sense of purpose in life, spiritual practice, and a common-centered outlook, which is good advice for us all. So thank you very much, and these are a few acknowledgments for this work is based on. Appreciate Ted's leadership in this arena, and also Chloe's. We've very much appreciated working with her.
Wonderful. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you again, Ted and Maria, for sharing this knowledge. I just want to add maybe two more things, and then I know that it's 3 o'clock, so if people need to leave, I understand, but if you want to stick around for maybe another 5 minutes or so and ask any questions you have, I'm sure that the presenters would be willing to give 5 minutes. But I would just add that in terms of things you can do in your church and what the NCC is doing, community gardens are a great way to build a local base of nutritious foods to feed your community as well as the community around you. Also thinking about church policies that you can create in your own church to reduce exposures to toxic chemicals or promote healthy eating. Are two other areas. You could also do a toxics audit of your congregation and find out what kind of exposures might exist in your building and how you can make it a healthier place to live. And then getting involved in community efforts with other congregations and with other community-based organizations in your community are all things that you can do as a faith community to improve healthy living. And also to try to maybe get some kind of seniors group together or intergenerational activities going in your congregation. These are other ways that you can help promote healthy aging. All right, I'd like to see if there's any questions now. If you would like to, I think there's a way to raise your hand on this thing if you'd like to ask a question, or I might just go ahead and turn everyone off mute and see how that goes since there's only 8 of you. So does anyone have any questions at this point?
Are you going to send out the PowerPoint?
We will. We are actually recording this whole webinar right now, and we will be putting it up on our YouTube site after we're done with this. So probably in the next week or two, we'll do a little bit of editing and get it out there. So I'll make sure to share the link when it's done so you all can have access to that information.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
That's very good.
Yeah, I want to say thank you so much. I'm exhausted from listening, but it's great exhaustion.
Well, get up and take a walk to sort of quiet yourself down.
Yeah,
that's right.
Burning those calories up.
I cannot wait to share this information with our church because we're looking strongly at how do we address this issue, and I feel like you've given me a lifespan orientation towards addressing this, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks. Can you mind sharing your name when you speak?
Oh,
I'm really looking to speak.
My name is Sharon Stoltz, and I'm from Oak Park, Illinois.
Thank you.
Great.
That's great feedback.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, Chloe, this is Mary Mendenhall from Oak Park, California, but I asked the PowerPoint question. So I thank you because you gave us names to some of the organizations and programs that are into the good urban development and planning. I had no idea that there were actually people working in that regard that were so organized. So I'm really looking forward to us being able to make our communities more holistic.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions?
Chloe, I'm afraid I have to go because I have another call to coordinate.
Well, then I just want to close by, again, thanking you all for participating in the webinar and coming out to listen to this wonderful information, and for your feedback and your willingness to share it. And please help get this information out into your communities. We have this grandparents letter on our website, and I'll make sure to send you all a couple links after this for follow-up information. And thank you to Ted and Maria again for taking your time to be part of this. There's going to be a great conference coming up that Ted and Maria have been very involved in organizing, and the National Council of Churches is actually co-sponsoring. And I know you have to go, but maybe you can say just 2 seconds worth of information about that conference in New York.
Oh, yeah, I should have put a slide up, but I can certainly send you the flyer or anybody that wants some information. It's called Healthy Environments Across Generations. It will be June 7th and 8th at the New York Academy of Medicine in New York. 1 day and 1 half day, and we have a stellar lineup of some amazing speakers. We're calling it the Unconference because there won't be any PowerPoints. There'll be a lot of conversations and a lot of interaction and some interesting creative expression by artists of all media and musicians. And we think it's going to be a powerful event that's going to help move create more of a movement to be considering the multiple environmental influences on health across the lifespan. So it's an intergenerational event, and also it's a multi-environmental event. So you're certainly welcome to visit. We have a whole page on the CHE website that's devoted to it, and we're grateful for the co-sponsorship of National Council of Churches. So thank you, and hopefully we'll see you there. And it's very low cost as well. So you can sign up for $35, or even if that's a problem, you can call us and let us know.
Great. Well, I'll make sure to pass around information on that after this call. Okay.
Thank
you very much,
Thanks,
Ted, Maria, and all of you.
Okay.